This, of course, was about politics and the media in a way. And it's trying to deal with what is the most troubling thing about American politics right now, this really intense polarization between the two parties and this kind of essentially paralysis that's going on in government.
Some of the same factors that apply how people perceive risk also apply to how people form and make sense of policy debates and their preferences. But the same processes, what we often overlook, also apply to us as influentials, as decision makers, as communities of groups trying to solve these problems. We might have a better understanding of the complexities and the technical details of these policy problems, but in many cases, the same type of attribution process that the public makes sense of the reality of climate change, the same attribution process applies to how we make sense of the complexity of the politics of climate change or the politics of other policy debates. Our own like-mindedness, our own selective information sources as decision makers and influentials lead to then selective attributions about what might be driving polarization among the public. Polarization is a two-way street. Polarization is part of a larger, broader area of the psychology of perception. Some Democrats are learning about climate science. Many of them are seeking out or motivated to pay attention to that issue. But for the most part, they're simply, just like Republicans, following a very different set of political cues that are being set for them by their admired political leaders, people like Al Gore and other political leaders among their party. The context for perception for Democrats is set very differently about their opinion leaders. It's not that they necessarily understand the science better, but rather they're simply following a different set of political cues.
A point I want to reinsert into the discussion that I think is really important here is what I would, to some extent, call the tyranny of rationality. And this notion that if you have rationality, then you have right, and that makes the different fundamental normative worldviews, especially, I believe, on the left, particularly intolerant, because they think they have science on their side. I just think it's really an important part of this problem is the kind of immunity that thinking that you own rationality gives you from achieving disagreement with your opponents. And when my liberal friends, and most of them are, talk about conservatives or voting against their own interests, I say, that is fabulous. I love the fact that they can do that because it means that they're not ruled by some mythic idea of optimality that allows them to simply think they can vote for somebody just based on some linear view of their interests. So I think we should all aspire to voting against our interests in the sense that we usually mean that as a critique of conservatives.
One of the things I notice of the left is an abandonment of one of the core principles, which I've always thought of as part of liberalism, which is tolerance grounded in the tradition of American pragmatism. Walter Lippmann, who's the great journalist and pragmatist, once said that the goal of politics is not to get everyone to think alike, but to get people who think differently to act alike. I think that the right and the left have actually developed an intolerance where their appeal is to authority and absolutism rather than what actually works in practice. This is why I think President Obama has had so much trouble with elements of the Democratic Party, is that there's a sizable number, particularly on the far left, who are critical of any deviation, even if it's in the service of pragmatism and getting things done, recognizing we live in a very complex society with many points of views and values that have to be shared for action to occur.
Part of the problem of this polarization is that the two political traditions, liberals and conservatives, have very different approaches to forming their positions. And liberals could stand to learn from the conservative tradition and more explicitly articulate its core political philosophy.
The right has worldview movements, public philosophies. The left has single issue groups and no public philosophy. If you look to the right of center, there are basically three coherent, independent worldviews. There's the libertarians, there's the neoconservatives, and there's the religious right. And these are true public philosophies. There is nothing like that to the left of center. The liberal positions, quote unquote, are simply those of the single issue groups that are all collated, right? So what is the liberal position on immigration? I'll offend everybody here in the next 5 minutes. It's what La Raza wants, right? What is the liberal environmental position? It's what the World Wildlife Fund and the Sierra Club and so on want. If you tried to reconcile these different things, you would go crazy. But imagine how different the environmentalist conversation would be If you had a group of social democrats got together and said, okay, on the basis of generations of social democratic philosophy, what is the appropriate approach to the environment and resources and so on? It's not just whatever the fundraising single issue group wants at the given moment.
I wanted to take issue with the idea that liberalism has no underlying intellectual principles. I think it has two, and the problem is that they're just deeply in contradiction, and that's why you can't feel them. But there's this huge contradiction within liberalism between wanting a culturally diverse society, but at the same time believing that autonomy is so important that everybody should agree with the liberalization, the liberty of the individual.
So what can be done about this polarization and the current state of our politics? Well, for one, it helps to step back and look at the big picture and take the long view.
1980, I moved to the United States. I moved from a country that was riven with class warfare, where we had an outmoded socialist party with a centralized ideology facing up to the emergence of Margaret Thatcher and a neoconservative policy. I came to a United States which was still on the tail end of bipartisanship, and I was extremely impressed by the fact that I saw here in the legislative processes people from both sides of the aisle getting together, co-sponsoring bills, supporting policies. In the last general election in Britain, it was virtually impossible to slide a piece of paper between the policies of the three major political parties in the UK. There was really no ideological differentiation whatsoever. What we have to take into account here is what are the historical movements between high levels of bipartisanship and polarization, and the possibilities for shifts to take place there. The other thing is to recognize that the other pathology from the strong polarization that we're seeing here is actually the lack of political differentiation. We need to reinvent liberalism in the UK just as badly as it needs to be reinvented here, so we can have some political controversy, for God's sake.
One of the best ways to overcome differences across political communities is to localize the issue. And if you start to get people to agree at the local level on these issues, you start to recreate trust and a sense of efficacy that something actually can be done about climate change and energy.
Let me be a little hopeful. Can I be hopeful?
Yeah,
Is that okay?
yeah,
Is that permitted?
that would
Okay.
be awesome.
All right. I would never have imagined the day after 9/11 that an African-American man with a name like Barack Hussein Obama would end up as the next president of the United States. I would never have predicted that. I don't think anyone on this stage would have predicted that, and yet it happened. So I would ask everybody to sort of keep your minds open to the various opportunities where people and circumstances can be leveraged for new opportunities and new possibilities that you would not necessarily anticipate from a planning perspective 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 years out.
Thanks.
Commercial.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everybody.
everybody.
You see many of you up front.